Hey guys, how you doing? It's Mr. Urban here. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the debate over slavery and mainly the Missouri Compromise and really the Compromise of 1850. So, to get things started here, we're going to talk about the land that was acquired. This large chunk of land that you see on your screen here in this map that says Mexico is going to be acquired via the Mexican American War. We learned about this last year. Really, the war was kind of quick. We went in there, Santa Anna, the leader of Mexico, he quickly said no more, no mas, and Mexico, this big region, became the United States of America. Now, what are we going to do with this? We have in green here slave states, and in red we have free states. And there is a very uh, dangerous line that we're treading here with whether this new land is going to become free or slave states. So the great minds of the time in the country try to come up with different solutions of how we can determine free or slave states for this area. And the first solution comes by way of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. I like to think of each solution that was made or idea that was brought up as a band aid, okay? The country at the time has a cut. The cut is the idea of slavery, the institution of slavery, and it's not stopping, right? Imagine a cut and it's bleeding, and we don't have enough resources to stop this cut totally, so we're going to put band-aids all over it. And that's kind of what we're doing. We're trying to hold back a war, and ultimately we're going to get there, but this is really the events leading up to that. So let's start with the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which divided land into free or slave regions. You learned about this. Missouri would become a free state. That is that line that you see right there. So the line prohibited slavery north of latitude 3630. Now, what that means, if we were on a globe, a big world globe, we would take this line and we would extend it outward, right, with the curvature of the earth. We wouldn't go this way because these have already been determined slave and free states. So imagine this line went straight across here. Everything up here would be free. Everything down here would be slavery. That's the first idea. Now, these things happen over the course of a couple decades. This is 1820, right? Some people then came up with the idea of using popular sovereignty, which we talked about already. Popular sovereignty is the idea that political power belongs to the people. So the great idea which America was built on, democracy, would or could be used to determine whether each area or state that eventually comes to this area would be free or slave. Okay. Next, we're going to talk quickly about the Free Soil Party, which you also already learned about. So there's a little bit of review here before we get into the main idea of the Compromise of 1850. To attract voters, neither political party, the Democrats or the Whigs, we didn't have Democrats and Republicans back then. I kind of want to point that out. We have Democrats and Whigs. The Whig Party, it doesn't last that long, but in comes another political party. Today, we see this like with the Green Party. We see people who claim to be independent. It really doesn't stick in America's political landscape. At the time, we had Democrats and Whigs. Those are the two major players. So the Free Soil Party comes in, and what they are, they're a northern-based party, and they want to end slavery. So what they do is they create something called the Wilmot Proviso, and they get 10% of the popular vote. That's not going to get it done, okay, guys? And I'm going to show you here what that Wilmot Proviso was. So, as I stated, some Northerners want to outlaw slavery completely. These Northerners that we're talking about are the Free Soil Party, and what they propose is that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of the territory. So this big chunk of land that we acquired from Mexico, it would be prohibited to ever have slavery. No slavery whatsoever there. That's not going to go over well with the South, guys. It's just not. So They appealed to a certain group of individual that really wanted to end slavery, but at the time the word just wasn't out yet. We'll talk about that in a minute. So we talked about sectionalism. I believe Ms. Beyer talked a little bit about that. And the way I think of sectionalism at the time of the country that we're talking about now is it's a big zipper, right? Sectionalism is dividing apart the country. We have the Northerners who want freedom, we have the Southerners who want slavery. And as we keep talking about it, we're just opening the zipper further and further and further. And ultimately, what happens is nobody can agree on a solution. We're not going to agree on popular sovereignty. We're not going to agree on giving the whole Mexican cession to free or slave states. And we don't seem to want to agree with democracy. So, what are we going to do about that? Uh, Before we really get into all that, we're going to do another little recap, and we're going to talk about the California Gold Rush. Why are we talking about that? Well, in 1849, there was this huge thing called the Gold Rush. That's why we had this football team here today called the San Francisco 49ers. In 1849, people flocked to the area of California because some guy found a gold nugget in a creek. With all that being said, so what is he talking about? What does this have to do with anything? Well, because so many people went to California, it upped the number of residents in California to over 60,000. It literally was a boom. And that's when we talked about boom towns last year. Uh, a lot of the people that went to California during this time were free statesmen or Northerners that opposed slavery. So when a population booms to over 60,000, you could then apply for statehood. And for Californians at the time, they wanted to become a free state. They said, hey, we want to become a state. Can we be called California? Great. And the problem with this is, as we've been talking about, the balance between free and slave states would change, favoring the free states. And as Ms. Yao talked about on one of her previous videos, if we had a soccer team with an uneven amount of people on one side, it just wouldn't be fair. Um, if we were going to vote and we had an uneven amount of votes, it just wouldn't be fair. The one side with the majority or more players or more voters would always win. So we couldn't have that. The South said, no way, this is unacceptable. We can't have this. So in comes another compromise. 30 years later, we have the Compromise of 1850. We have all these people getting up and talking in Congress about what are we going to do to fix this issue. So, as we look over here, Henry Clay, who's a senator, proposes a compromise to maintain peace. He said, let's try to make a compromise. Stop yelling at each other. Let's try to figure this out. So, Daniel Webster, who is part of the Whig Party from Massachusetts, big northerner, who's also represents New Hampshire. He's a congressman. He's 3 times Secretary of State. The guy's a big deal. He speaks swimmingly. He loves this compromise. Oh, this is the best thing ever. Really, he's all for it because if you really take a look at the compromise of 1850, it does favor the North. Um, and as you see on this next key point, John C. Calhoun, the seventh vice president from South Carolina. If he's from South Carolina, guys, he is a big slavery guy. He's weak. He's near dying. He's so old. He's hard to look at. They're like, Calhoun, sit down. We don't want to talk. We don't want to listen to you anymore. He would go on and on. So he gives his speech near death. And of course, he supports slavery. He says, we're not going to have this. There will be no compromise, right? So in comes the key points from the compromise. And here you see this fine balance beam of slave states versus free states. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of this thing, the Compromise 1850, guys. Number one would be the California would enter the Union as a free state. Yay! That is a huge win for the North and the people of California who don't support slavery. They're like, well, we're not going to be a slave state because we're from northern states. That doesn't make any sense. So number one, California would enter the Union, the United States, as a free state. Number two, the rest of the Mexican cession, that is the area which we got from Mexico, would become federal land. Okay, there's no Nevada, no Utah, no Arizona, no New Mexico. None of this stuff has occurred yet because you need people in the area for that to happen. So this would become federal land. This is a big chunk called a territory. In the territory, popular sovereignty would decide on slavery. Yay for democracy, right? So people are really happy about that, and we're going to get people who move to these areas and they want to support slavery or they want to support this new area as a free state. And we'll talk about that later on when we talk about bleeding Kansas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But let me not get too far ahead of myself. So that's number two. This area would become federal land, which would be determined by the people. Okay. Next one, and this is kind of an oddball one that's thrown in here. Texas would give up land east of the upper Rio Grande, which is a river. In return, the government would pay Texas's debt from when it was an independent republic. What the heck does that mean? Well, if you look here, I always like to show this to the kids in school. Texas wore a lot of different hats, right? They were under control of many different countries. Spain, France, Mexico. They wanted to do their own thing for a minute. Then eventually, so we're in the area of they wanted to do their own thing for a minute, and then they're going to come back to the United States. So they kind of, hey, I want to be with you. No, no, I don't. Hey, I want to be with you. No, I don't. And that's kind of happening a bunch of different times. But in this time right here, if you look at the map prior to the Compromise of 1850, Texas is really huge. It kind of goes up here. It does this weird hook, goes way up here. That wasn't going to fly because Texas owed some money to the states for bailing them out multiple times. If you take a look at the map over here now, during the Compromise of 1850, Texas would give up this big chunk of land that they had here to get its debts paid by the United States. And they are a slave state. I just want to point that out. So I'm not quite sure who this is a win for. You could argue it either way. Win, you could say, for the North because Texas becomes a smaller area, and that area that it used to have can now be determined by popular sovereignty. Or you could say this is a win for Texas itself in the South because now Texas has its debts removed. So that's number three. Texas gives up land, and it changes the landscape of what Texas actually looks like. Number four, and you guys are going to be like, well, I don't understand how this wasn't a thing already. Didn't we talk about this? So number four says the slave trade, but not slavery, would end in the nation's capital. So what that means is there would be no more trading of slaves. There's no more people going on boats to Africa. Now I say this, and it sounds like a good idea, but we learned about the Clotilda and how people were getting transported back and forth for much longer than this. But the law now stated we're not going to have any more slave trade in the country, right? The slaves that are there, we're going to keep them there, and the institution of slavery can still exist, but we're not going to go out to Africa anymore seeking slaves. So that's a big win at the time for the North. It's a huge win. And last, because there's a 5-part thing here, this plan, we would have a more effective fugitive slave law, and that would be passed. And just to briefly talk about the fugitive slave law, anybody who was aiding slaves and escaping to the North could be persecuted, or prosecuted, I should say, to the fullest. They could have jail time, they could be hanged. There could be a lot of issues that would happen if you were helping slaves. And what it meant for slaves themselves who escaped to the North is they could be going about their business in the free states. Finally, they escaped to freedom, and boom, they would get caught and brought back to the South. That's why when we watch some of those movies, the characters in the movies were trying to get to Canada because of the fugitive slave law. But a more effective fugitive slave law was passed, and that is a huge win for the South. So as you can see, there's a lot of give and take here, and some that are kind of in between when we talk about the Compromise of 1850. Here's what the landscape would look like after the Compromise of 1850. So we see areas of freedom and slavery in 1854. All the green is in fact slave states, and all of the red would be free states. And then the area in between, it says open to slavery by the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Bill. So it's open to slavery, but it doesn't necessarily mean there will be slavery, because that would be in fact determined by popular sovereignty. So we have a decent balance right now between free and slave states. Now, how did people feel about this? The compromise gets put up in Congress, and a lot of people like it. Some people are on the fence. But let's see what Senator Henry Seward from New York defends anti-slavery views and wanted California admitted directly without any conditions, without qualifications, and without compromise. So we want to have California be free of compromise. It should be a free state no matter what. Boom, done. I don't care. We don't need a compromise, right? Let's just make it free. If the people there want a free state, let them have a free state. It's not good, though. We couldn't have that just be the case. We had to give a little and get a little. And I say we because we're Northerners, and we are, in general, very much opposed to slavery. So this guy right here, we have John C. Calhoun. He argues that California shouldn't be entered as a free state. Not at all. He says that the slave states should be allowed to secede from the Union. And essentially what that means is he wants the southern states or any slave state to leave the United States of America. Which doesn't go over well with the Northerners. And you could see, like I said before, the zipper is just opening and opening and opening, and it's going to be hard to zip it back up, right? There's too many band-aids put on this situation at this point. Now we have congressmen very angry with one another. They don't agree with each other at all. And this isn't just like Democrat, Republican stuff that we see today. This is like people's lives are at risk with the institution of slavery. So Daniel Webster writes a speech, okay? I'm going to read this to you, and then I'm going to break it down because it is rather confusing. There's a lot of really big words in here. So he says, I hear with distress and anguish the word secession, especially when it falls from the lips of those who are patriotic and known to the country and known all over the world for their political services. Secession, peaceable secession. Sir, your eyes and mine are never destined to see that miracle. The dismemberment of this vast country without convolution, the breaking up of the fountains of the great deep without ruffling the surface. Who is so foolish, I beg everyone's pardon, as to expect to see any such thing? Sir, he who sees these states now revolving in harmony around a common center and expects to see them quit their places and fly off without convolution may look to the next hour to see the heavenly bodies rush from upon their spheres and jostle against each other in the realms of space without causing the wreck of the universe. There can be no such thing as peaceable secession. Whoa, okay. So what that means, guys, is the idea of somebody leaving the United States peacefully is a joke. He is like, what are you, out of your mind? You think we're just going to let you up and leave because you don't like that we don't want slavery? No way, no how. And if you think that we're going to sit here and let you talk badly about this country, you got another thing coming. So to me, what that means is these are like warning shots that are being fired off by Daniel Webster in the North saying, hey, if you think you're going to up and leave, like, you better be ready for a fight, because we're not going to have it. We're not going to allow you to come in here and mess with democracy and what the people want, right? And now this is all from the Northern perspective. So I'm sure the Southern perspective could be a little bit different. But the idea that, and the reason why we show you this quote is because there really is no fix here. Somebody said they want to leave the country, and it's going to be on, guys. We're so close to this thing really just blowing up in everyone's faces. So when we're in class, I like to do this thing where we create political cartoons. It's going to be kind of weird because We don't have paper and pencil in front of us, and political cartoons are kind of difficult to do. So we're not going to do that this year. And I know it stinks, but I wanted to show you the exemplar that I made a while back. And this kind of sums up the compromise of 1850. Here we have Uncle Sam, and he is all patriotic. He's decked out in America, woohoo. We have two stick figures down here. One is the North, is lighting a fuse for the North, as you see here. One is lighting a fuse for the South. And the country as a whole and the people who are the politicians of the country are kind of, so we have Clay here, we have Webster here, and they're kind of trying to do their best to stop what's going on, and most importantly, Webster. So Uncle Sam is shooting a water gun, and it says the Compromise 1850 because that's what he's doing. He's shooting water to stop the flames that are going to eventually lead to boom, the Civil War, which is going to be the blow up of the country north and the south, not literally, but figuratively. So I'd like to share that with you guys because this really in itself is a great representation of what the compromise did. It's just another band-aid, guys, and we're moving closer and closer to eventually the Civil War. I know I spoke at length just now, but I really think it's important that we understand the Compromise of 1850 to the fullest because it is like one of the final band-aids before this thing goes kaplooey. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you stuck it out through the whole thing. And what we're going to do now is you're going to look and see on the bottom of the page, each page that I just went through had numbers on the bottom. So you're going to look and there's going to be an assignment with questions in a Google Doc. So each question will have a number and that number will relate to the slide. Okay. So if you see on your Google Doc, it says one, or it says two, you'll be answering this question, a question from this slide. If you get to, it doesn't say anything until, let's say, 5. It's not that I messed up, that it went 1 and 5. It's that the next question comes from slide 5. All right. I hope everybody is safe and well. And thanks for sharing some history with me. Have a good one, guys. Bye.